Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Inshallah, I hope everyone is doing well. Today I would like to recite for you a story within the Quran. And this story is the story of Ibrahim al-Islam when he comes to his people and he begins to question them regarding that which they worship. And there's some interesting things to consider within the story. As we go through it, we will talk about those things. I hope that you will take the time to sit with me for a little while and enjoy the story. So, the context of the story really is one in which Ibrahim al-Islam finds himself a little bit perturbed about his people having gone astray and have taken up the worship of various idols. And the Quran says that we bestowed on Ibrahim al-Islam some judgment, and well were we acquainted with him. So at this point, he was spiritually mature, and he had obviously reached a spiritual state that was that was worthy of him questioning and seeking to guide his people. Now, typically, yes, we can mention the fact that he is a prophet, but this is more. It's more important to recognize that God is talking about his spiritual condition, right? And we know this because it says that we had bestowed upon him some judgment. And some judgment is oftentimes mentioned in the Quran when God wants to indicate a blessing or spiritual state. And interestingly enough, it's actually not used solely or in reference to a prophet, but it can also be used in reference to non-prophets. And we've seen this as well. And particularly one of the instances that comes to mind is the sleepers of the cave. In the Quran, we see that they are praying to Allah for some judgment. And they are not, of course, prophets. Essentially, what sound judgment really refers to is a spiritual state. It could be, as is stated in the study Quran. It could be in reference to spiritual maturity, being rightly guided, remaining on a straight path, as Ibrahim had inclined towards monotheism, which is the straight path. In the Al-Mizan literature, we see that it can refer to the primordial being, or the fitra. And of course, I mentioned in my previous videos that the fitra really has to do with inclining towards one's nature. And one's nature, which is the fitra, is a primordial nature that embraces and inclines toward the divine. Anyways, without bogging down the story with too much detail, I just wanted to make that short, brief reference. Okay. So in the Quran mentioning his some judgment, the Quran is saying that he's now ready, right? He's really ready for this task of coming to his people and trying to guide them out of the state of spiritual ignorance, which can be said they lack sound judgment or sound guidance, so to speak. So the Quran says that, behold, Ibrahim alayhi salam said to his father and his people, what are these images to which ye are so assiduously devoted? Now, of course, one can imagine that back in those days, that the images to which they were worshiping were reflections of their belief in various, perhaps, pagan gods, so gods that represented elements of nature, etc., etc. They said, by way of responding, they said, well, we found our fathers worshiping them. And what's interesting about this statement is that it's one that the Quran tends to warn us as Muslims against, because typically the Quran highlights that part of why people are misguided is because they basically follow what their parents or what their society or culture have bequeathed to them over time. And basically they have responded in like manner to say, well, we're only following what we saw our fathers doing, right? Culturally, this is the culture and the heritage that we have received from our forebears. And just as the Quran warns us against this, Ibrahim says, indeed, ye have been in manifest error, ye and your forefathers. So he says to them, hey, even you and your predecessors are obviously on a wrong path, right? You've taken a wrong path. They said, well, have you brought us the truth? Or are you one of those who just? So they're not quite sure, where what's this all about? Where is he coming from? Are you saying that you know something better than our forefathers? Have you brought us the truth? Or are you just, or is this a joke? He said, well, nay, your Lord is the Lord of the heavens and earth, and he who created them from nothing. And I am a witness to this truth. So, so here we have it. We know that Ibrahim now, for sure, we know that at this point he is a prophet for sure. He's been anointed. Or at the very least, his spirituality is such that he is now aware, because of his spiritual status, and hey, these gods to which you worship is not the real God, right? That I know who the real God is. And of course, I can only imagine back in those times, of course, in any time that you tell someone, hey, listen, I know who God is, it's a kind of an arrogant and if not crazy thing to really say. But, he comes out with it and says, well, I am a witness to this truth, right? Right. So your Lord is the Lord of the heavens and earth, and he created them from nothing. And I am a witness to that. And he goes on, he says, and by Allah, I have a plan for your gods, after you go away and turn your backs. So the Quran says, so he broke them to pieces, all but the biggest of them, that they might turn and address themselves to it. Right. So they had, they were having this discussion, and he told them, hey, listen, when you're gone, I have a plan for these gods of yours. He doesn't say exactly what the plan is, but he says, I do. And they leave, and surely enough, the Quran says that he broke all of the various idols that they had in their temples or wherever, places of worship, except the biggest one. right? And he did that, of course, because he wanted them. He had, like you said, he had a plan, and he wanted them to address it. In what way? We'll find out. When they came back and they found out that this had happened, they said, "Oh, who has done this to our gods? He must indeed be some man of impiety." They said, "We heard a youth of talk of them. He is called Ibrahim." So it's interesting that the word impiety is used about the defilement or the breaking of these gods, as if to say that, there's something sacred about these gods, even though they are, of course, as we as Muslims, the way we obviously interpreted this event is that those gods are false gods. And of course they say, well, we heard this guy by the name of Abraham talking about our gods earlier on, so maybe it's him. So they said, well, then bring him before the eyes of the people that he may bear witness. So when they brought him, they asked him, they said, well, art thou the one that did this to our gods, O Abraham? He said, nay, this was done by, he says, this is the biggest one. So, right? So he starts off by saying, well, no, this is done by, and then he said, well, no, hey, listen, this is the biggest one. Ask them if they can speak intelligently. So his plan was obviously to get them into a situation to show them the reality of their situation. Remember, the answer that they gave to him prior was that when he asked them, well, why do you worship these things? And of course, the answer was, well, it's almost as if to say, well, we saw our forefathers worshiping them, but really what they were really saying was, well, we're habituated to worshiping them because this is what our forefathers did, right? So what he did was he conducted an experiment where he can shock them into realizing that, hey, listen, what you have been doing all these years, right, is based on habit, and you don't even realize really what's actually happening. And so this event was designed by Abraham to psychologically shock them into awakening. Because he says, well, I know who did it, but ask this one, right? And essentially what he was trying to get them to see was that their gods were absolutely useless, right? Not only were the gods present when this happened, and now that and that they were incapable of defending themselves, not to make things worse, they were also incapable of informing them what had happened to them so that they can defend their gods. So on both fronts, it seems to be that they might not be able to help their God. So the Quran says that when he did this, they turned to themselves and said, well, surely, well, ye are the ones in the wrong. So in that moment, they came to understand what Ibrahim was trying to tell them. Essentially, that these gods that you worship cannot even help you. They're useless for you. And therefore, they are of no effect. They are false gods. So the Quran said in that moment, they were so shocked that they realized, oh, wait a minute, yeah, we're definitely misguided here. We're definitely in the wrong. The Quran says, then they were confounded with shame. They said, Well, thou knowest full well that these idols do not speak. Abraham then said, do ye then worship besides Allah things that can neither be of any good to you, nor do you any harm? So, having had the experience of being shocked into awakening, spiritual awakening, they denied what Abraham had done for them, which was to make them aware and conscious of this habitual practice or worship that was getting them really nowhere. Now, they may have persisted after having realized this and after having felt ashamed of this for other worldly motives. Maybe it was a source of prestige. Maybe it was a source of wealth for them to maintain their priestly class or activities or the temple, etc. We don't really know. But what's very clear here from the Quran is that the Quran says that they realized what they were doing and they realized the falsehood in which they were steeped in. And yet still they started to make excuses. They said to Abraham, well, Abraham, obviously you know our gods don't talk. So it's not that the gods can't talk, it's just that they don't talk. Now, of course, Abraham says, well, are you worshiping something that can neither be of any good or harm to you? Now, this statement is interesting because what this statement implies is that it tells us a couple of things. That perhaps what they really meant when they said, well, Abraham, you know our gods don't speak. Perhaps not that they don't speak, but that they're not able to speak. Because he says, well, why would you worship something that can neither be of any good or harm to you? Meaning good, meaning that had these gods had the capacity to speak, they would help you. So that would be a source of help and benefit to you. So now that you know that they can't benefit you, would you worship something like that? But the interesting part the interesting part about this statement is also the fact that he says, not only can it not benefit you, nor can it be of any harm for you. And this part is a very interesting part because it speaks to the divine majesty and power to which belongs only to God, in that God has the capacity not only to do good, but he also has the capacity to do harm. Now, harm, of course, God is not intent on doing harm. Don't get me wrong, but it speaks to his majesty in that if God intends some good for you, nothing can change that. And likewise, if anyone seeks to rebel against God, God has within his capacity, right, to refute that, right? In this sense, it can be interpreted as to cause harm, but essentially means to defend his will against any attempts for it to be thwarted. Essentially, is just what this is referring to. So the story at this point shows us that these gods neither has this power. And this is really the power that Abraham wishes to convey or give to these people, that is inherent in the belief of this one God, the God of Abraham, that he has the power to bless them. He has the power to reward them. He has the power to be a source of benefit to them. And likewise, he has the power to punish them or to call them to account, particularly as to why it is that they are refusing to listen to his guidance. And of course, Abraham says, fie upon you and upon the things that you worship besides Allah, have ye no sense, right? So he's saying, well, why would you worship something that can be of no good or no harm to you? And he has already made this point very clear to them, that these idols have no benefit for you. Now, in recognizing the wrong of their ways and in feeling embarrassed and ashamed, they said, well, burn him and protect your gods, if you do anything at all. Now, the story in the hadiths is that they concocted this they built this elaborate structure by which they wanted to put him in and to burn him, etc., etc. And it would be something that everyone would be able to witness. But the Quran says that when they went ahead and did this, he said, O fire, be thou cool and a means of safety for Abraham a.s. Then they sought a stratagem against him, but we made them the ones that lost most. Now, we don't know what the stratagem is, and I don't want to get too much into that because I don't want to bog down the story with too many details. What's interesting here is how the story takes a very, if a contemporary person, a person of reason, a person of science is listening to this story, they would probably consider this story to be fanciful, mythical, in the sense that it's not real. It has no reality in the real world. It's a made up story. Of course, we as Muslims believe that God can do anything, and in fact, the very Quran was revealed so that man can do anything, right? That man can live beyond the constraints of his physical or corporeal reality, okay? That we know that God has said that if we follow this Quran as it should be followed, then we, as I've stated in previous videos, will have the capacity, as God himself does, to say to a thing, be, and it is. So when we listen to these stories, yes, we recognize that they appear to be rife with miracles, and yes, may be perceived as unscientific. But the Quran is telling us the story because it wishes to remind us of this power that is inherent in the Quran, in the revealed word. So when we hear these statements that God says, and be cool for the fire, we are not alarmed or embarrassed, or should we be, about these statements, because they are rooted in spiritual realities that go well and beyond the corporate restraints of this world. Okay. God goes on to say, but we delivered him and his nephew Lot and directed them to the land which we have blessed for the nations. And we bestowed on him Isaac, and as an additional gift, a grandson Jacob al-Islam, and we made righteous men of every one of them. What's interesting about this story is that it seeks to bring home the point that any God or anything that we worship, if it doesn't have the ability to be of any source of good for us or harm, then this is not something that we should worship. Now, you may ask the question, well, how has God himself been a source of good for us. Muslims, of course, believe that the world was created by God, and the world is a source of blessing. It's a source of mercy. In it, there's all sorts of blessings that God has already bestowed. And these blessings include everything that we experience in the world. The ability to live freely, the ability to breathe, to eat, to experience joy, love, laughter. Being in the world is itself a blessing to which we ought to acknowledge. And when we acknowledge that, we have to attribute this blessing only to God. An interesting fact about the Quran, every time a prophet comes to his people, one of the things he always says to them is, "Will ye not fear Allah and obey me?" And what's interesting about this statement, in every example when a prophet comes to his people or his community, is that he always makes this statement, "Will ye not fear Allah?" And it's interesting that Ibrahim al-Islam makes the statement, why would you worship something that neither is of benefit to you, meaning that can be a source of help or goodness or blessings, or something that can be a source of harm for you? It's because that God intends, right, for his creatures to be aware not only of the fact that he is merciful and that he is tender and compassionate, and that he overlooks and he forgives enormously, and that he is more inclined towards being more merciful and 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 tender towards his creation. The world itself is a sign of this mercy, is a sign of his generosity, is a sign of his love for us. So his mercy is extensive. And in fact, the Quran talks about, if you try to tabulate all the mercies and blessings that God has bestowed upon mankind, you will not be able to tabulate them. Thus is his mercy. So it is not that God is vengeful or God is wrathful, or certainly God intends or is bent on these attributes. However, God nonetheless wishes humanity not to go unmindful of that aspect of himself as well. Yes, God is severe in punishment. And this is something the Quran has reiterated many times, that not only God is quick in punishment, severe in punishment, but he's also quick in punishment. The most important thing, of course, to keep in mind is that there is this balance between God's mercy and God's wrath. And to lose sight of either or is problematic within Islamic spirituality. The Quran says that whoever despairs in the mercy of God, excuse me, whoever despairs in the mercy of God is someone who disbelieves in him and is someone who despairs. And in fact, despair is actually considered a sin. And in fact, someone who, certainly from the perspective of the Quran, who despairs in the mercy of God, God says that that person is not a believer. In other words, he is not someone that believes in me. This is how much God wants in Islam for us to believe in him, to turn towards him, to ask his forgiveness, to seek him out. However, God says that God is severe in punishment, and that on the day of judgment, that we will face the punishment of our own deeds, the things that we have done, as a requital for what we have done. And God says that these requitals are severe. and that the prophets are a mercy to us to guide us away from that particular outcome. And this is why it's so important to believe in Allah, because Allah is the only deity, the only divine, the only source of, the only creator who is able to inflict harm upon us or bestow some good upon us. And this story of Ibrahim al-Islam seeks to hammer home this very point. So the question you have to ask yourself when you're seeking to be spiritual, whoever you are, is, are you worshiping something, or are you involved in a practice that can be a source of good for you? Or if you were to go in contradiction to it, to what extent will it be a source of harm for you? And these two questions is important when we look at what it means to be spiritual and what it really means to worship. I want to thank you for your time. I hope you guys are staying safe in this time of COVID with your families and looking after yourselves. Assalamu alaikum, and take care for now.